Hey there and welcome back to another Blue Sky video. And today, I want to talk about the film Robots. And more specifically, how I don't think that this film gets enough of the recognition it truly deserves. Like seriously, this film's great. At least, I think it's great. And yet, here we are, 17 years on from its release, and to me, it feels like it's been forgotten to time and has well and truly slipped deep into the depths of obscurity. And I think that it's a damn shame because despite its lack of any real recognition now, or even at the time of its release really, this film, at least in my esteem, is one of the best animated films of the 2000s. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's on the level of Pixar's hot run of films during that time, or the first two Shreks or something like that, but I feel like it's a tier or so below it, which still means it would rank firmly above the majority of animated films from that time period. But anyway, enough gushing, let's talk about the movie. Released in 2005, Robots tells the story of Rodney Copperbottom, a young robot from Rivettown who aspires to be a great inventor in the backdrop of a world populated by sentient robots. Of particular interest to young Rodney is the great inventor Big Weld, founder of Big Weld Industries, a company that sells spare parts and hires new inventors to help innovate society and make new advances in robotic technology. Over the years, Rodney continues to walk the path of the inventor, culminating in the creation of Wonderbot, a small robot that's supposed to help his father work as a dishwasher, but who malfunctions almost straight away and causes extensive damage to the restaurant, leaving his family in debt. To help pay off this newfound debt, Rodney moves to Robot City to try and get a job at Big Weld Industries using Wonderbot. But he finds himself rejected by Phineas T. Ratchet, the current head of Big Weld Industries since Big Weld's apparent retirement, who declares that the company's now shifting focus to only produce expensive upgrades, no longer selling spare parts, and shifting away from the old company motto of see a need, fill a need. And on top of that, he's secretly abducting outmoded robots and sending them to his mother's chop shop to be melted down and turned into fresh ingots for his upgrades to be made from. Downtrodden, Rodney befriends an outmode named Fender, who takes him to meet his friends and fellow outmodes, the Rusties, who Rodney then works with to fix other outmoded robots who can't afford to get upgraded by Big Weld Industries. And thus, Rodney quickly becomes a local legend and a hero of the downtrodden robots of the city, but is forced to try and find Big Weld in order to get access to more spare parts. And after making an enemy of Ratchet at the Big Weld Ball, where Big Weld was supposed to attend, Rodney befriends Cappy, another of Big Weld Industries' executives, who takes him to Big Weld's house, where the two try and convince him to take the company away from Ratchet. Whilst he initially refuses, he eventually realizes that Rodney's right, and he, Rodney, Cappy, and the Rusties all go to the chop shop to try and shut down its operation and engage in a final climactic confrontation against Ratchet, his mother, and their army of robots. And after Madame Gas gets killed, Ratchet's chained up on the ceiling next to his father with all his upgrades stripped away, and Big Weld announces the return to the old way of doing things, selling spare parts, see a need, fill a need, and all that good stuff. Rodney's the hero and he lives his dream and happy endings all around. And at the time of its release, I think for the most part the film did really well. For starters, whilst it didn't exactly set the world on fire in terms of its box office performance, I don't think it would be fair to say it was a flop or a disappointment either. It had a budget of around $80 million and it grossed $262 million, so yeah, it did well for itself. Nothing outstanding and a lot less than you'd probably want from a studio that created Ice Age, but at the same time, it was still early days. And there probably would have been room for a sequel to bring in a bigger box office gross. But of course, that didn't happen. And in terms of its critical response, well, it didn't get panned. It has a 64% on Rotten Tomatoes with an average score of 6.6 out of 10, whilst its Metacritic score is 64 out of 100. And based on what I've seen from the reviews, it seems like people really enjoyed the visual aspect of the film, whilst not being very enamored with the story. And I think this might be a contributing factor as to why the film sort of just faded away. It doesn't really get talked about all that much. Maybe it might feature in a meme or two here and there, but it seems to have largely faded into obscurity, and that pisses me off. What am I missing here? Am I the only person that rates this thing as one of the all-time greats? Am I deluded? A delusional fool? A complete hack who doesn't know his ass from his elbow? Because I'm definitely starting to feel that way. Like I'm the only person in the world that thinks this movie deserved better. The only person that thinks it's well and truly earned that cliche title of being an underrated gem. I know, people have gotten quite sick of that sort of title being tossed around, but to me, it's just so true. It's one of the great animated films of the 2000s that's been completely forgotten about. And honestly, there's probably a number of other factors that point to why it's been left in the dust, but ultimately, I also think it has to do with the fact that this film was a fresh franchise from what was a relatively minor studio for the time. Yeah, Ice Age was big for Blue Sky Studios, but they really cemented that legacy over the late 2000s and the early 2010s as maybe not a DreamWorks level studio. They're firmly behind them in the number 4 slot, I'd argue. Also, real talk for a minute, rest in peace to Blue Sky Studios. What the hell? Feels like an end of an era, and I didn't even realize they'd been closed down until I was doing some research for this video. It feels like a piece of my childhood has passed away, and I didn't even realize. But anyway, let's bring it back on topic. Visually, the film's stunning. It has a style that's so unique and different to what we normally see from the big studios. A style that's both polished and yet rustic. Cartoonish yet realistic, beautiful and brutalist, all stuck together in a mismatched sort of world. And that sort of description does kind of make it sound like it would be a really big visual mess. But they make it work. Old machine designs mixed with new chrome designs create a sense of time. Like a real city, where old historic buildings are put next to hyper-modern buildings, and it creates that visual clash. And the film replicates this in its design, especially with the various unique designs of all the different characters. Simply put, it's a visual feast. And since it's the land of robots with static faces, hard edges and rigid movements, on top of the unique visual style, it still also holds up quite well even today, in an era where we're seeing animation ascend to even more hyper-realistic heights. And I think it should be commended for that. I mean, sometimes I look back on a beloved franchise and I think, ugh, those visuals are hard to watch. I don't really get that from robots at all, and maybe one day I will, but that day is not today. But beyond its visuals, I actually think its characters and story are also quite top tier. And I don't care what the reviewers say. I don't care what anybody says. The narrative elements that make up this film are very solid. And that, combined with the aforementioned stellar visuals, really does make me think that this film deserved a better critical score than 64%. Like, come on. It's better than that, surely. And we'll start with the characters, and I will admit that Rodney is a pretty generic, vanilla, baby-faced everyman hero. He's young and naive, happy and kind, and completely unprepared for the actual reality of the world that he lives in. And I really like that. Him being generic and fresh-faced is very relatable. Like many young people who leave high school and go off to university or to a new bigger city, thinking that they know all the answers, that they're going to be the next big thing, and they're going to change things. And the majority of the time, people get a harsh reality check and are forced to come to terms with the fact that things aren't so simple. And ultimately, that is Rodney's character arc. And honestly, that's what the wider story's about. Realizing that sometimes things don't work out the way you planned, and instead of changing the world straight away, you need to start out small and build up, which is exactly what he does throughout the course of the movie. And his character and story is supplemented by a lot of fun and interesting side characters. Cappy, his love interest, isn't just some attractive damsel in distress character. Honestly, in most of their interactions, he is the one that fits that title. He's the one who's pretty much the damsel in distress throughout most of their story. Fender, I don't know what it is about him, maybe it's just that effect that Robin Williams has, but he's just so good as a comic relief sidekick. He has so many funny lines in this film, and he just enhances every scene he's in, whilst also not being around for too long, which is what a lot of films get wrong. The comic relief sidekick should stay as that, the sidekick, and they do keep him firmly in that role, and it pays off immensely. He doesn't get oversaturated, and he doesn't overshadow the other stories. But even beyond that, it isn't just the main heroes that are highlights. The villains, whilst a bit mustache twirly, are quite well developed. They aren't just evil for the sake of being evil, or have some generic blood feud. They're simply greedy, and they're trying to enact a corporate takeover to kickstart a shift in robot society and make themselves rich, whilst also clearing away elements of society that they deem to be undesirable. They're villains with clear motivations that make sense for the world they live in. And I'm not saying they're the most deeply developed villains ever, but they aren't assholes for the sake of being assholes either. And that's not all, because there are heaps of minor characters that are just good fun and really enhance the story being told, even if they're only in 1 or 2 scenes. The action is fun, diverse, and visually striking. The story flows well and is engaging, telling a simple story about a robot who fights back against a society that wants to brush away old models and their robotic heritage and diversity, to simply replace them with shiny new upgrades which will make everybody conform to Ratchet standards, and also force them to pay for the privilege. And like I said, it's a simple story, but that doesn't make it a bad story or boring or generic. Not everything needs to be overly complex. A lot of the most classic stories told over centuries are relatively simple and straightforward, because people can connect with them. And I think Robots is a more modern example of a simple story creating a damn good film. I don't care what anybody says, this film's glorious. But ironically, despite what I just said about not caring what anybody says, as we've arrived at the end of the video, I do actually want your opinions. What do you think of Robots? Do you agree with me that it's an underrated classic, or do you disagree? Is it trash? Maybe you sit somewhere in between. I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.